torturas se aplican en Brasil, en Uruguay, en Bolivia. Es decir, hay una opresión a estos países que son países que les están proporcionando riqueza a todas estas grandes empresas y que los tienen sometidos, pero que están reaccionando porque cada día crece la resistencia. Yo estoy convencida de que el momento de liberación para Latinoamérica va a llegar. Puede ser que demore un poco, pero va a llegar, porque un pueblo se agota, la paciencia tiene un límite y la miseria no puede seguir en esa forma.
This is a film about psychological warfare.
왜곡된
A specific type of warfare designed to distract, misinform,
But trust me,
and anesthetize the brain. It has many disguises
많은 모습으로
and is used against every one of them,
아울러 노동자,
against them
어린이, 일반 인민 한
and against them.
사람을 대상으로 하고 있다.
In it, we discuss three kinds of atrocities. What we call benign bloodbaths, which nobody cares about, constructive bloodbaths, which are the ones we like, and nefarious bloodbaths, which are the ones that the bad guys do. The principle that I think we ought to follow.
There must be something greater. If such a complicated instrument as human body was created, obviously there must be some higher purpose for that. And it's very easy to avoid destabilization by denying the greedy companies one little freedom, one little liberty, forcing you into turning yourself into processors of unwanted products and goods. They turn you into machines, like the worm who there's inlet and outlet. So, and how long an average appliance lasts these days? Less than a year. Why? Where's workmanship? Oh, we want you to buy more. Okay.
Every CIA station during that period, and I would expect today, was required to maintain what was called the Subversive Controlled Watch List. This was a list of the most important left-wing political activists in the city or in the country, and the list would include not only their name, but the name of their mother, the name of their father, of their children, of their wife, their address where they lived, the address where they worked, the places they would go with their friends, clubs they might belong to, where they would undertake their leisure activities, everything we might need to know for sudden action against that person. These lists would be usually maintained in the CIA offices and kept up to date. But whenever necessary, they were turned over to the local police or the local military authorities for action on the part of those authorities.
Great efforts are made in trying to achieve and maintain that ideal.
아끼지 않는다. 대중이 스스로
Anything that keeps the masses from organizing themselves and asking important questions about what their masters are really up to. Of course, such Machiavellian activity requires a disguise, which is why propagandists call themselves the public relations industry.
But do not be fooled.
Public relations and propaganda are interchangeable. And it is the massive public relations industry that is designed to alter perception, reshape reality, and manufacture consent.
A Hollywood set designer was brought in to create a $200,000 backdrop for official war briefing.
Good morning, welcome to Air Mills. 3, 2, 1, take 2. Good morning, welcome to Air Mills. Good morning, welcome to Air Mills. 3, 2, 1, take 2. Good morning. Welcome to Erin Mills Town Center.
오늘날 미국 하나만 봐도
Today, America alone has more public relations propagandists than reporters,
이 사실은 서구 사회
which means that nearly half of what people in the West hear, see, or read is written by professional liars.
할수 있다. 전문 거짓말장애의
Professional liars whose job it is to keep people in front of their televisions,
잡지들을 읽도록 하며
reading gossip magazines, eating vast amounts of toxic food, and shopping, always shopping for the latest fashions and trends, and shopping, always shopping.
Who owns them? Major agenda-setting media, after all, what are they? As institutions in the society, what are they? Well, in the first place, they are major corporations, in fact, huge corporations. Furthermore, they're integrated with and sometimes owned by even larger corporations, conglomerates, so for example, by Westinghouse and GE and so on.
What I wanted to know was how specifically the elites control the media. What I mean is, I guess...
It's like asking, how do the elites control General Motors? Well, why isn't that a question? I mean, General Motors is an institution of the elites. They don't have to control it. They own it. You know?
Except, I guess, at a certain level, I think, like, I guess I work with student press, so I know, like, reporters and stuff.
The elites don't control the student press, but I'll tell you something. You try in the student press to do anything that breaks out of conventions, and you're going to have the whole business community around here down on your neck, and the university's going to get threatened, and, you know, I mean, maybe nobody will pay any attention to you, that's possible. But if you get to the point where they don't stop paying attention to you, the pressures will start coming. Because there are people with power. There are people who own the country, and they're not going to let the country get out of control.
우리는 우리 마음에 파고드는
We must remain vigilant at all times
항상 경계의 고삐를
and be alert to their insidious attack on the mind.
이전에도 그러했듯이
For they have come before,
이러한 공격은 또
and they will come again. And it is America that has invaded 37 countries in the last 50 years.
I was there as a correspondent. This horrific picture.
우리는 단 한 차례도 다른 나라를
We
침공한 적이
have invaded none.
And that's a very respectable piece of history, and I can appreciate how much work goes into that.
You know when I did that work?
When did you do that?
I did that work in the early 1940s when I was about 12 years old. The first article I wrote was right after the fall of Barcelona in the school newspaper, and it was a lament about the rise of fascism in 1939.
Well, you spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets used the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB.
Actually, I guess one of the people whose biggest influence in my life was an uncle who had never gone past 4th grade. He was, you know, had a background in crime, then left-wing politics and all sorts of things. But he was a hunchback. But it was a very lively place. He was a very bright guy. It was the 30s. There were a lot of emigres, you know, so on. A lot of people were hanging around there. And in the evenings, especially, it was sort of a literary political salon. You know, every kind of guys hanging around, arguing and talking. And as a kid, like I was 11, 12 years old, the biggest excitement was to work the newsstand.
Or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country.
축으로 서구 소비노예 집단이 왜 자기네
Don't the consumer slaves of the West want to know why their forces are occupying our country?
당신이 행복하지
Or
않다면
drink this beverage?
서구에서는
The
이런
West calls these images advertising.
Somewhere there's a room with a baize-covered desk, and there are a bunch of capitalists sitting around, and they're pulling strings. I mean, I hate to tell Noam Chomsky this. This is the current fashion in universities. And I think it's nothing but a fashion. It's a way that intellectuals have of feeling like a clergy. I mean, there has to be something wrong.
You don't share that.
I think it is the most absolute rubbish I've ever heard.
So what we have in the first place is major corporations, which are parts of even bigger conglomerates. Now, like any other corporation, they have a product which they sell to a market. The market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. What keeps the media functioning is not the audience. They make money from their advertisers. And remember, we're talking about the elite media, so they're trying to sell a good product, a product which raises advertising rates. And ask your friends in the advertising industry, that means that they want to adjust their audience to the more elite and affluent audience. That raises advertising rates. So what you have is institutions, corporations, big corporations, that are selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what point of view would you expect to come out of this? I mean, without any further assumptions, what you'd predict is that what comes out is a picture of the world, a perception of the world that satisfies the needs and the interests and the perceptions of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Now, there are many other factors that press in the same direction.
Advertising is both propaganda and propaganda distributor. Advertising is about hawking product and creates artificial needs, since most products are completely unnecessary.
Your favorite music?
Advertising unashamedly fosters unhappiness with oneself and with one's possessions. In fact, the very purpose of advertising is to open up emotional vulnerabilities and make people feel that without this product, they are defective.
You need to protect your skin, you need to hydrate your skin, you need to moisturize your skin, and you need to repair your skin.
Corporations employ psychologists, writers, and filmmakers to sell what is essentially the same product. One of the tricks of effective advertising is to identify the product with a highly desirable quality that has widespread appeal. If you buy this, you will have clear skin and become attractive to others. And more beautiful. Use this product and pretend that you too can be a farmer. Drive this car and appear liberated and adventurous, like these actors.
You write in Manufacturing Consent that it's the primary function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. What are those interests?
Well, if you want to understand the way any society works, ours or any other, the first place to look is who is in a position to make the decisions that determine the way the society functions. Societies differ, but in ours, the major decisions over what happens in the society, decisions over investment and production and distribution and so on, are in the hands of a relatively concentrated network of major corporations and conglomerates and investment firms and so on.
Do they care?
그럼 이 사실을 도대체 알기라도
Do they even know?
They are also the ones who staff the major executive positions in the government, and they're the ones who own the media, and they're the ones who have to be in a position to make the decisions. They have an overwhelmingly dominant role in the way life happens, what's done in the society. Within the economic system, by law and in principle, they dominate. The control over resources and the need to satisfy their interests imposes very sharp constraints on the political system and the ideological system.
When you talk about manufacturing of consent, whose consent is being manufactured?
To start with, there are two different groups. We can get into more detail, but at the first level of approximation, there's two targets for propaganda.
The answer is that most of them don't know and don't care. That most of them don't know and don't care.
One is what's sometimes called the political class. There's maybe 20% of the population which is relatively educated, more or less articulate. They play some kind of role in decision-making. They're supposed to sort of participate in social life, either as managers or cultural managers, like, say, teachers and writers and so on.
Most of them don't know and don't care.
They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to play some role in the way economic and political and cultural life goes on. Now, their consent is crucial. One group that has to be deeply indoctrinated. Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think, and not to pay attention to anything.
Because their owners have full control over what they see and think.
And they're the ones who usually pay the cost. It's basically an institutional analysis of the major media, what we call a propaganda model. We're talking primarily about the national media, those media that sort of set a general agenda that others more or less adhere to the extent that they even pay much attention to national or international affairs. Now, the elite media are the sort of the agenda-setting media.
Far more seductive than opium, infinitely more effective at shaping behavior and expectations than alcohol and religion.
That means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major television channels, and so on. They set the general framework. Local media more or less adapt to their structure.
World News. It's a soundbite that says that there's a beachhead.
I think 628 is a good one.
Yeah, but I think 6 is a good start.
This is the operative soundbite for us. He's ours. He really knows how to time it.
He's got a minute for all the time, so that's...
I love this soundbite.
Okay, we'll look at it.
And they do this in all sorts of ways, by selection of topics, by distribution of concerns, by emphasis and framing of issues, by filtering of information, by bounding of debate within certain limits.
2.5 minutes to air. 45 seconds.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups in the society.
There is an unusual amount of attention focused today on the 5 nations of Central America.
These same methods are used to glorify the corporations who make these products. This is called corporate propaganda. The truth is that corporations exist only to make money and are even legally compelled to prioritize making profits over competing interests, such as the well-being of consumers. And there is no such thing as enough profit for the capitalist.
This is Democracy's Diary. Here for our instruction are triumphs and disasters, the pattern of life's changing fabric. Here is great journalism, a revelation of the past, a guide to the present, and a clue to the future. What happened years ago may have a bearing on what happens tomorrow. Millions of clippings are preserved in the Times Library, all indexed for instant use, a priceless archive of events and the men who make them.
There is a saying about legislation that legislation is like making sausage, that the less you know about how it's done, the better for your appetite. The same is true of this business.
That is, history is what appears in the New York Times archives. A place where people will go to find out what happened is the New York Times. Therefore, it's extremely important, if history is going to be shaped in an appropriate way, that certain things appear, certain things not appear, certain questions be asked, other questions be ignored, and that issues be framed in a particular fashion. Now, in whose interests is the history being so shaped? Well, I think that's not very difficult to answer.
The process by which people make up their minds on this is a much more mysterious process than you would ever guess from reading Manufacturing Consent. If you're in a conference in which decisions are being made on what to put on page 1 or whatnot, you would get, I think, the impression that important decisions were being made in a flip and frivolous way. But in fact, given the pressures of time to trying to get things out, you resort to a kind of a shorthand. And you have to fill that paper up every day.
There is no response similar to that one from United States to the Soviet Union. It stops halfway somewhere. It never reaches here. The theory of subversion goes all the way back 2,500 years ago. The first human being who formulated the tactics of subversion was a Chinese philosopher by the name of Sun Tzu. To 2,500 years BC. He was an advisor for several imperial courts in ancient China. And he said, after long meditation, that to implement state policy in a warlike manner, it's the most counterproductive, barbaric, and inefficient to fight on a battlefield. You know that war is continuation of state policy, right? So if you want successfully to implement your state policy, and you start fighting, this is the most idiotic way to do it. The highest art of warfare is not to fight at all, but to subvert anything of value in the country of your enemy, until such time that the perception of reality of your enemy is screwed up to such an extent that he does not perceive you as an enemy, and that your system, your civilization, and your ambitions look to your enemy as an alternative, if not desirable, then at least feasible. Better red than dead. That's the ultimate purpose, the final stage of subversion, after which you can simply take your enemy without a single shot being fired, if the subversion is successful. This is basically what subversion is. As you see, not a single mentioning of blowing up bridges. Of course, Sun Tzu didn't know about blowing up bridges. Maybe there were not that many bridges at that time. But the basics of subversion is being taught to every student of KGB school in USSR and to officers of military academies.
It's curious in a kind of a mirror image way. Professor Chomsky is in total accord with Reed Irvine, who at the right-wing end of the spectrum says exactly what Chomsky does about the insinuating influence of the press, of the big media, as, quote, agenda setters, to use one of the great buzzwords at the time. And, of course, Reed Irvine sees this as a left-wing conspiracy of foisting liberal ideas in both domestic and foreign affairs on the American people. But in both cases, I think that the premise really is an insult to the intelligence of the people who consume news.
Advertisements are nothing but bait, laid out for certain types of consumers.
For up to 14 times more volume.
These same methods are used to glorify the corporations
미화하는 데
who make
쓰이고는
these
했다.
products,
이것을 다른
which includes
무기들을
money
제조하는
lending and
세우는
manufacturing
제조
equipment
설비, 자금
for building
대출을
missiles and other armaments.
포함한다는 것을 의미한다. 진실은 기업은
The truth is that corporations exist only to make money and are even legally compelled to prioritize making profits over competing interests,
합법적인 방법으로
such as the
우선순위에
well-being of
올려놓을 수
consumers.
있다는 것이다.
This is the time sufficient to educate one generation of students or children. One generation. One lifetime span of a person, a human being, which is dedicated to study, to shaping up the outlook, ideology, personality. No more, no less. Usually it takes from 15 to 20 years. What it includes? It includes influencing, or by various methods, infiltration, propaganda methods, direct contacts, doesn't really matter. I will describe them later. Of various areas where public opinion is formulated or shaped. Religion, educational system, social life, administration, law enforcement system, military, of course, and labor and employer relations, economy, okay? 5 areas.
To eliminate confusion, all of this has nothing to do with liberal or conservative bias. According to the propaganda model, both liberal and conservative wings of the media, whatever those terms are supposed to mean, fall within the same framework of assumptions. In fact, if the system functions well, it ought to have a liberal bias, or at least appear to, because if it appears to have a liberal bias, that will serve to bound thought even more effectively. In other words, if the press is indeed adversarial and liberal and all these bad things, then how can I go beyond it? They're already so extreme in their opposition to power that to go beyond it would be to take off from the planet. So therefore, it must be that the presuppositions that are accepted in the liberal media are sacrosanct, can't go beyond them. And a well-functioning system would in fact have a bias of that kind. The media would then serve to say, in effect, thus far and no further.
And shopping. Always shopping for the latest fashions and trends.
Who owns them?
This is why they promote globalization, the new slogan for empire. It allows them to promote their symbols, also known as brands, by using slave labor in third world countries.
이런 제국주의적 브랜드는
These imperial brands are a symbol of value and meaning, like a flag. But their only allegiance is to profit, not country. And shopping, always shopping for the latest fashions and trends.
Who owns them?